Welcome to People Power Social Club, our daily digital event space ensuring no one feels isolated or alone whilst we spend more time at home.
And this time I'm going to be talking about sustainable energy without the hot air. But for those of you tuned in to the talk on Tuesday, which was all about the workings of a combustion engine, I thought maybe I should have been calling this sustainable energy without the hot exhaust. But I don't think my husband would be very happy with that, seeing he gave the talk on Tuesday. So we'll stick with sustainable energy without the hot air. It was a title which I've basically nicked, I have to admit, from Professor Sir David McKay, who was the chief scientific advisor to Ed Miliband and later on to Ed Davey in energy and climate change. And it came from his book, which, well, before I go on to saying that, I thought it was appropriate again to, as well as saying thank you to People Power for providing this platform for this talk, I thought it was quite neat that the sustainable energy without the hot air links directly into what People Power's strapline is all about. So we're talking about powering sustainable change, and powering is what we're talking about today. Energy, or energy used per unit of time, is power, and sustainably. And we need to change the way we actually use our power if we're going to be sustainable. When I was at Cambridge, we used to have a debate with our students when they joined us in the first week. What is your definition of sustainability? So I'll leave that with you in your heads. How would you define sustainability? But that's what this talk is all about, really: sustainable energy without the hot air. And that's the responsibility of all of us, because we're all using energy, and the way we use energy will pretty much dictate how governments provide our energy for us. And so, as I was saying, these slides were kindly given to me by David McKay, who I talked about in one of my other People Power talks. He was an amazing chief scientific advisor, sadly died at 48 in about 2015, something around that time. But he was the chief scientific advisor to government over that period. They were listening to him very closely and developing their policy based on his advice and the advice of his teams within Whitehall. And this book that he wrote in 2008, he was a physics professor at Cambridge when he wrote it. You can have a look at it for free online. He was very much about sharing what he did. And he wanted to just present the numbers, not talk any politics. He just wanted to look at the facts, and hence the title, Without the Hot Air. And as I mentioned in my last talk, so in 2008, he published that book and that website. But fast forward to this year, last month, it was scheduled that the 2050 calculator, which he then went on to develop at Whitehall as chief scientific advisor, that this Mark II of that Pathways calculator was due to be launched last month. And you can have a play with that yourselves. This is the numbers which every member of the public can look at, the numbers for the UK, and how we might make our energy supply versus our energy demand add up. Because, as I said, it's all about what we use, and the government is responding to us. So that's where you can go for more information if you want to after this talk. But I'm going to take you through a few of the slides that he gave me in 2009 when I was covering, as you may remember from the last talk, I used to cover for him when he became chief scientific advisor. I used to cover him for some of the talks he was scheduled to give. So just to introduce some of the units that were in his book, just to make it very easy for anyone to read his book, easy in quotes, of course. It's important for the general public, all of us, to understand the units we're using. So in his view in the book, it's very much about, okay, we don't want millions, billions, or trillions. We won't understand it. We want quantities that are comprehensible and comparable to each other. We want to look per person. So his view at the time of writing that book was, most of us couldn't access what the government was talking about, what our energy we were using. So we needed to make sure that the calculations were so that an individual person could see what their responsibilities were. So calculations per person to one significant figure. So he came to the conclusion that kilowatt hours, although that sounds techie, it's what is on all of our energy bills. We pay in those sorts of units. So if people really want to make the connection with what his numbers were saying and what we see every quarter on our bills, then kilowatt hour is the energy unit we might want to use. That would then correlate with perhaps how much energy do we use per day. So that's kilowatt hours per day. And then for future slides, we might want to talk about the watts or the power per square meter. And that's because each of us living in the UK, we have a certain amount of square meters, which you could say, okay, if you've got a certain population density, how many square meters can each of us command? So if you want to build a solar farm, then obviously we're going to use far more square meters than if we build a nuclear power station, because you're going to get a lot more power out of a power station, a nuclear power station, per square meter than you are out of a solar farm, if that makes sense. So at the time of writing his book in 2008, the population density dictated that in the UK there was about 4,000 meters squared per person. Now the population density in the last 12 years is increased so much that England, for instance, is now the most densely populated country in Europe. So therefore that number will have decreased. So in other words, in the UK we have less square meters per person to use to produce our energy than we had 12 years ago. So to give examples so that we can basically link it into our everyday living, for instance, 1 kilowatt hour, if you boiled a kettle for 20 minutes, you would use 1 kilowatt hour of energy. We perhaps eat 3 kilowatt hours of energy per day. If we have a bath, we use 5 kilowatt hours of energy. A litre of petrol would provide 10 kilowatt hours of energy, and an aluminium can would take 0.6 kilowatt hours of energy to produce. So, and he was very deliberate in putting those things in there, because you don't think, oh, a can of Coke, or there are other sort of brands of fizzy pop if you want to know about them, but a can of Coke is a sort of global comparable product. So a can of Coke, if you're having lots of cans of Coke, then one aluminium can uses a lot of energy to produce it. So it just puts things in perspective. So that's the sort of rationale behind the units. Then what happens on his website or in his book is that he looks at every part of our life, and again, we are responsible for the energy we need. So he looks at every aspect of our lives, and he compares the energy that we use per day in each of those areas. So, and we think of these as building blocks. So if you see in the bottom left-hand corner, this is the average amount of energy per day that we might need to run an average sort of year of car. So in this yellow at the bottom, which I'm sorry you can't see, it's not the average amount of energy per person for a car, because some people don't have cars. It's basically, if you have a car and you run it in a year in an average way, say about 11,000 miles, you will, forget looking at all the formulas, you can go back and look at that later, but you will need roughly 40 kilowatt hours of energy per day. Now, this was predicated in 2008 on an average of 33 miles per UK gallon. Now, as you will have heard from Tim on Tuesday, the speaker on Tuesday, the efficiency of engines has become much better. So therefore, this number will be less, because you actually got way more efficient cars. So that's good news. So we would hope that the average user of a car would use less energy now than then. That's presuming that they don't do more mileage than they did 12 years ago. But there's a bounce effect. I could go on for ages about these things, but there is a bounce effect. So in other words, it's been shown that if fuel is cheaper, or if engines are more efficient, often people just use their cars more. So it doesn't always translate into energy saving, because people will just say, okay, I can afford more now, so I'll use the car more. Okay, so chapter by chapter, he looked at our lives and he built up what our energy demands are, for instance, the car or the plane or the amount of heating in our car. And then on the other side, the green blocks down here, take example of wind energy. Where is our supply going to come from? If we have this much use in cars and planes, and where is that energy going to come from? So what he did was, this green block for wind is not what was currently being produced in 2008. This was Professor McKay saying, if we were to have an Apollo-like attempt at putting wind energy into Britain, into the UK, and we say covered 10% of our individual acreage allowance. So in other words, if at the time we each had 4,000 meters squared per second, and we used 10% of that, i.e. 400 square meters each, so that's 10% of the land in the UK being used for wind energy. So a huge effort, we would produce enough wind power to supply half of our car use in a year. I was gobsmacked when I saw that first. So in other words, we would have to cover, say, the land maybe the size of Wales. I think Wales about 10% of the overall of Britain. Roughly speaking, we would be able to supply half of a year's car each year. And that also, by the way, at the time was twice as much wind power as the whole world. 50 times Denmark's, Denmark is seen as one of the countries that produces a lot of wind energy, and 7 times the amount of Germany's. So at the time, this was a gargantuan effort, and we would still only provide enough energy for half of an annual car use. So every chapter, energy supply, on the one hand, the red blocks, energy supply, the green blocks, energy demand, the red blocks, okay? And then he put them all together, and he said, okay, let's look at a car, let's look at jet flights, let's look at, if we were to each take one transatlantic flight each in a year, it would use 30 kilowatt hours of energy per day. Okay, so that's equivalent. So that's one flight would be almost equivalent to a whole year's use of a car. Okay, hence the emphasis you see around the whole climate change debate about reducing air travel. So just by looking at the numbers. So that's just one transatlantic flight. Similarly, he took a chapter on heating or cooling your houses. So that's where you see a lot about being talked about solar loft insulation and solid wall insulation, and basically insulating your home so that you don't lose your energy through the walls and through the roof. And that you can see actually for one person for a whole year per day per person is almost equivalent to a car. So hence the emphasis by the government on making our houses more energy efficient. And so on and so on. And there's a whole chapter on stuff, which I've done a separate slide on for you to have a look at, which is quite an interesting one, because it's all the stuff that people don't tend to think about. We can relate as individuals to all these driving, to heating our homes, to flying around maybe. And we all like our gadgets. We've seen the government promote quite rightly the use of energy efficient, low energy light bulbs. But this was, in my opinion, more about promoting the idea of being energy efficient, because you can see that as a section of our lives, light is a very low, we use very little energy lighting our homes and our lives, whereas compared to flights and cars and heating, it's much higher. So this slide shows, okay, on the one hand, here's all the stuff we do. This is our demand, the red stuff. If you were to, like the wind, if you were to go really and make an Apollo effort to produce energy in all these renewable forms as much as you can, so solar heating, photovoltaic cells, solar heating being heating your water, solar thermal, as opposed to photovoltaic cells. You've seen them more and more, photovoltaic farms, the solar farms that are besides our motorways. You can often see farmers have quite rightly diversified into that. Biomass fuels, biofuels, wood, waste incineration. and so on. So if you were to look at all the energy supplies we could use and you were to push forward on them as radically as you could, you would, this would be the number, these would be the numbers. So in 2008, when he produced this book, he just used to present this slide and say, okay, we move forward on renewable energy as hard as we can, and this is where we get to. And then he would just pause and let the audience see for themselves that unless we reduce our demand and radically extend our renewable energy supply, we were never going to make the numbers add up. So then he would just ask the question, well, can Britain live on its renewable energy, ... What do you think? So still to come, as it says, this doesn't take into account industry, road building, defence, hospitals. And so you can see it then and still now, it would be very difficult to live on our own renewables, at least as we currently live. Incidentally, my husband gave me a really interesting printout from the International Energy Agency, which I can forward around to people if you're interested, which came out on the 30th of April. And the energy demands at the moment, because of coronavirus, is the weekly energy demand is down somewhere between 17 and 25% globally. So we, because of coronavirus, have seen that much energy demand reduction because of coronavirus. But that's, if we have to make a gargantuan effort to reduce our demand, that's the sort of demand that we are talking about if we're going to bring this red block down. So going back to that interesting red block called stuff. So David looked at all the other sort of more peripheral stuff we do, and it adds up to quite a substantial amount. For instance, we're often encouraged to renew our tech every 2 years. You know, you need a new iPhone, you need a new computer. They are very energy intensive, and there is still very patchy recycling and reuse processes to reusing and renewing recycling computers. So that energy is very energy intensive. As I mentioned before, 5 cans per day on average. Apparently, in the UK, people drink about 5 cans per day. So going back to the amount of energy used to create a can, that is a lot of energy. Making stuff in China and shipping and transporting it around. I think when he wrote transporting rubbish, I'm not sure if he meant that stuff we buy from China's rubbish. I think he meant at the time we were shipping, if you remember my plastic bottle story, we were shipping a lot of our rubbish to China. So it literally does mean transporting rubbish around. We would take energy to take our waste to the other side of the world. So this whole block of stuff is, you know, maybe there's some huge gains to be made there. That was the point to this slide, you know, is that there's a lot of savings to be made, and we need, if the numbers are going to add up, perhaps that's what we need to do. So, okay, so where does that leave us today? Because I've gone for a much shorter talk, so there's more time for questions. Like I said, you know, where can we make these savings? We've seen this year, 12 years after this book was written, we've seen Boris Johnson announce that the government will be insisting that we all move to electric cars. And so the combustion engine, sadly, is on borrowed time. As though my husband, I say that provocatively, it's a difficult one. I know that Johnny Simons is here with us today. He works at combustion with Tim, my husband, and for them, this is about their livelihood. This is about the livelihoods of companies like combustion. They've always worked in measuring emissions. Their work has always helped the automotive companies improve the efficiency of emissions from engines. But with this picture, surely, with us moving to electric cars, we're going to have to all make a paradigm shift in the way we think about combustion engines. So where are we all going to sit when it comes to our own lives, and how we're going to make these sorts of numbers per person add up? And at the time of writing the book, So going back to that slide, remember I was saying that this is the gargantuan Apollo effort of moving forward on every renewable energy supply that we could. And one of the things that really stuck with me when I used to listen to David speak was that we are so fortunate in the UK because we have really good opportunities for renewable energies in Britain compared to some countries. For instance, tidal, people tend to think of tides coming in and out at the coast, but there is a huge sweep across the top of Scotland. So if this is the Atlantic and this is the North Sea, twice a day across the top of Scotland, the Atlantic Ocean sweeps into the North Sea and back out again. So we're talking about industrial scale tidal. We are very privileged in the UK to be able to have that potential. But this is what the reality was of the amount of renewable energy at the time in 2008 that the UK was providing. Now you will know, because you will have seen all the wind farms springing up offshore in a big way, and onshore is very visible as well. So these numbers will have changed substantially. And at the time, people couldn't, when I was first doing these talks in 2009, people could not believe that wind could be ramped up on that scale. But we've seen that over the last 11, 12 years. Sadly, we are still in this field, we're still sort of concerned that there's very little research and very little push going on in tidal energy. So this big sweep I was telling you about, what's happening in the North Sea. We've seen the depletion of oil and gas in the North Sea. We've got infrastructure in the North Sea that is sitting there on the seabed doing nothing. We've got infrastructure on platforms that could possibly be used to help with the whole harnessing of tidal energy from the North Sea, perhaps. So what's happening on that? That's still a question to be answered by government. If you want to check this out yourself, so my last two slides, if you want to keep an eye on what's happening in terms of your energy supply, so what's providing you with your energy needs, then I really heartily recommend this website, the GB National Grid Status. It's run by an independent guy who, much like folks in People Power, I think, just someone who's a real community spirited, good citizen. And he realized that several years ago that there was nowhere where you could go and see what was happening on the national grid and where the energy was coming from. So he collates all the data and he produced this website which actually gives you a real-time account of what's happening with energy. And it might look something like this. So this is a snapshot of what was happening last Sunday at 17:40 on Sunday evening. And it was very windy that day. I don't know if you went out and about, but it was pretty windy. And at 17:40, the amount of energy coming from wind for that day was 40% of the day's needs, over 40% already. And that was only by 5:40 in the afternoon. There was gas, 16%, nuclear, 19%, biomass, 5%. And guess what? No coal. And I think Anna, I can see you there, Anna was the first person to point out to me that it's been many weeks since we've used coal, which is good, positive, because our energy demands are low at the moment. I guess they can get away without actually needing it. So do have a look at that website. I heartily recommend it. And you can see that the amount of wind energy in the last few years, it goes, you can look daily, weekly, monthly, yearly, and the amount of wind energy has seriously increased. So it's complicated. I mean, but it's not insurmountable. So it's complex, this whole picture of what our demands are and where we're going to provide our energy. It's a challenge to us all. It's a challenge to us as engineers, but it's a challenge to us as citizens, and it's certainly a challenge to governments as well. As I said, maybe said in one of my earlier talks, it's a third industrial revolution. The steam engine was, you could argue the steam engine wasn't the first. Actually, you could argue that paper was the first, and coal was the second. But it's the third industrial revolution, and we've done it before. So the engineers I've met believe that this is technically achievable. So we're optimistic, but it requires all of us to move. Are you optimistic? And I will finish there for questions. But I'd like to point out that I chose this slide deliberately because when you get despondent about this whole world and how this relates to climate change as well, for instance, because if we have emissions from all the energy we use, then as I've said in one of my earlier talks, the energy roughly correlates with the amounts of emissions we produce. But we can get a bit despondent about it. But if you think back to my story on plastic, when I first did this talk 11 years ago, there was mountains of plastic bottles. We didn't do anything with them other than maybe ship them to China. And look where we're at now with plastic. You know, we are really moving in the right direction. So it can be done with plastic. So we need to really believe that we can do it with the other things. And it just requires us all getting there. So I'll just stop there and say thank you for listening.
Stay safe, stay busy, and tell us a cool story next time we see you.